Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our special guest, Helen Tworkov. My name is Cortland Dahl. I am the co-founder and executive director of Tergar International, and I'm super excited to be here with you all and to be here with Helen. We've got more than 2,000 people who are joining us from around the world. We are live streaming this on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and it should be a fantastic conversation with a really remarkable person. So welcome, Helen. Fantastic to have you with us. So I just wanted to say a few words about Helen before we dive in and begin the discussion. And I thought it actually might be nice to start in a little unconventional way by sharing how I first encountered not Helen personally, but her work. So I started meditating in the early 90s, and I quickly became really fanatic learning about Buddhism and was reading everything I could get my hands on. And one of my most cherished collections of Buddhist writings was a stack of Tricycle magazine. I actually still can picture my bookshelf, and I had all my favorite books. And I had a whole huge stack that I was collecting of Tricycle magazine at the time. And it somehow felt like this was almost like part of my identity, that there was a whole magazine that was geared to what I was interested in. And I just thought it was so cool. I just loved having that in some of my around my most cherished books. So Helen is the person I can thank for that, and we all can thank for that because I'm sure there's countless people who have that same experience. She is the founding editor of Tricycle magazine and has really been at the very center of the transmission of Buddhism and the ancient practice of meditation into the modern world, and particularly into the modern West. So as you'll see, she's just had a remarkable, fascinating life, and we're going to hear a lot about that. She has co-written a number of books with Mingyur Rinpoche. So for those of you who are students of Mingyur Rinpoche, you probably already know that she co-wrote with Rinpoche, both In Love with the World and also From Confusion, Turning Confusion into Clarity. So she's played a huge role in Mingyur Rinpoche's world, in addition to all of her work with Tricycle. And we have her with us now because she's written a wonderful new book that I have been enjoying tremendously called Lotus Girl, which we'll also hear about, but I would highly recommend you go and buy and give it a read. It's just a really wonderful read filled with insights. So I thought we could just dive in, Helen, and go back to the very beginning. One of the things that I learned about you, actually, we've known each other for years, but I felt like I was getting to know you all over again through this. And it occurred to me that you've kind of grown up around the high priests of the New York art world. I, of course, know you through your Buddhist work, where you've spent so much time around some of the leading Buddhist figures, and in many respects, although you would never admit this, you're kind of one of the high priestesses of Buddhism in the modern world. But you kind of grew up in a very different world. So I wonder if you could just take us back to the very beginning and talk about what it was like to grow up around all of these great artists and these cultural luminaries, and how perhaps that put you in touch with the inner exploration that has defined your life in many ways.
Thanks, Cortland. It's a big question. You know, when you're a kid and you're just growing up, you're sort of inside your life. And I don't know, people want to know what it was like growing up in the art world. I don't know. I don't know. You know, it's just there were these artists, and then there was my life. And I learned a lot about what it felt like to other people, or I learned something about what that was like through other people. At some point, I saw that growing up in the art world meant something to other people that never meant anything to me as a kid, as a little kid. What meant something to me as a little kid is that I grew up with this tremendous disjunctions. I grew up in many different multiple worlds at the same time, My family didn't have any money. We grew up in a working class neighborhood. We were visited by very wealthy collectors. So people would come to to our tenement apartment in limos and taxi cabs, which we never could take. So there was a lot of people in my family who had worse financial circumstances than we did. So there was a lot of poverty, a lot of wealth, a lot of highly educated people, a lot of uneducated people. I grew up in a building with a whole bunch of little boys, Catholic, Polish, Irish boys whose fathers were cops. My father was an abstract painter. So there were all of these different kind of colliding universes. And it left me very depressed. I was a very unhappy little kid because I never knew where I was or where I was supposed to be. It left me very disoriented, but it gave me some kind of curiosity about what was going on. And so even the very things that were so difficult for me as a child, in retrospect, I have to be grateful for because they led to some kind of questioning and some exploration from the very beginning, like, where am I? What's going on here? I could never take anything for granted. And so that very much was part of my own journey.
Mm. And from those early years, did you have a rich inner life? Was that something that only awakened through meditation, or was that something that you really had from early on? When did that begin for you?
What does rich inner life mean?
I mean, there's so much. I mean, as a kid, I would say if I think about my own life, I was very focused on what was going on in the world around me. And for me, it was really probably in my late teens and early 20s when this whole idea of exploring the mind and I wouldn't think about it in these terms, but just the idea of having an inner life began to mean something to me. But in your book, you can kind of see glimmers of that earlier on, and I'm just kind of curious when that became a conscious experience for you.
Yeah, I hadn't really, I think of inner life and the term is so often used in terms of spiritual journey. And so
Mm,
I didn't quite get it in terms of childhood. Yes, when I was a child, I think because I was always trying to figure out things, I did have, I was I spent a lot of time in fantasy when I was a child, a lot
mm,
of time removing myself through fantasy. But I also learned that through fantasy, you could actually run interference with reality, that it actually could remove you from things around you that you didn't want to deal with. And I was very interested in that possibility. And so I started playing with what the mind could do. And in that sense, it was a quote, rich inner life. I had fantasies that if I could walk around with my head stuffed with yellow petals, that nothing could bother me. That turned out to be not quite true. But I started playing those games about how to work with the mind, how to use the mind to run interference with reality.
mm, mm. And it's clear that that thread continues. So it was sort of an interesting, the way you write about it. Of course, your life is filled with all these colorful characters. You're going interesting places, you're meeting interesting people. And then at a certain point, the inner exploration seems to almost start taking over and kind of becoming more prominent in that. So I wonder if you could just start maybe sharing a little bit about how that happened for you. You obviously started traveling in Asia, you spent time in Japan, you went to Nepal and India, a bunch of other places. At what point did the outer exploration and curiosity you have start to shift inward?
One way to answer that question is at some point I got that the mind actually was the key to suffering and to liberation. And I don't, that didn't come like overnight. It wasn't like a aha moment. That happened very, very slowly. Well, I think maybe there was some insights that could happen kind of quickly, but then to actually apply that to my life, that took a long time.
Hmm.
And um, and even after I had more and more confidence in what that possibility was, it still took longer to actually work with it in any kind of deliberative way, any way that would have actual consequence. It's like, oh yeah, the mind, I see the mind creating this suffering. Now what? Just go have another drink. It's like it took a long time to actually. So I see the mind is creating all these problems. Now what am I going to do with that mind? And so there's nothing linear about my own path. I kept circling back to um, yeah, I kept circling back to certain insights and then moving away from them, circling back. It was not easy.
And the time you were getting interested in all this stuff was just so different than the age we're living in now. I mean, there's literally thousands of meditation apps. There's all these courses that just kind of lay everything out so, in such an orderly way. I imagine that at this time it was all new and it was a big kind of smorgasbord of ideas and teachings. And, so how did you make sense of all of that? I mean, was there a sense, I mean, you talked about being struggling with depression and, the some of the challenges you were facing in terms of your own emotional patterns and so on. Was the idea of kind of being on a path something that was there in your mind, or were you just kind of fumbling around and trying to figure it out?
I think for a long time I was fumbling around and trying to figure it out. And also for a long time, kind of walking backwards. I knew a lot about what I wanted to get away from. It took me a long time to turn around and walk towards something that I wanted to know about. I,
Hmm.
and in the book, I talk about a very peculiar situation that happens with my father. Excuse me. When I was a junior in high school, he gave me a book by Ouspensky, a book about Gurdjieff, the Western mystic Gurdjieff, and he said that he wasn't interested in it, but he thought I might be. And I could barely make sense of that book. I could barely read, for one thing. I had dyslexia problems, but I was determined to try to read this book. In that book, there are many things I got from this. Well, he talks about a path. He talks about a seeking and a path, and there does seem to be some sense of going forward, and that was kind of a new idea for me. I don't think that had entered into my life at that point. And then about 5 years later, when I'm 20 years old, I see this photograph of Thich Quan Duc, and
Hmm.
and that's how Lotus Girl opens. It opens with this iconic photograph of the Vietnamese Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in Saigon. And for Americans my own age, everyone saw that photograph, and no one who ever saw that photograph ever, ever, ever forgot it. Many people today don't know the photograph, and even Americans my own age conflate the photograph with a protest against the American war in Vietnam. It actually wasn't. Thich Quan Duc was protesting the the his own government's crackdown on Buddhist clergy. At that point, the government was under the authority of a fundamentalist Catholic named Diem. The country was about 90% Buddhist and 10% Catholic, but he had this great idea to eradicate Vietnam of its Buddhist heritage. And that's what he was protesting. And uh, so the amazing thing about that photograph, and many of you might know, there was a recent self-immolation in New York City last week in front of the courthouse downtown where Trump is on trial. And because there were 10,000 reporters, that self-immolation got a lot of attention. And there was some attempt to compare these two things, which they have nothing, to my mind, nothing to do with each other. But it's very hard for Americans to imagine that this could be an act of sacrifice, that it was not an act of insanity, which appeared to be the case downtown. And we have seen other self-immolations, but we've never seen, or at least I have never, ever seen, a self-immolation where somebody is sitting in complete equanimity. And that's what he showed us. It was this combination. He was wearing robes, he was sitting in full meditation posture, and he was sitting in total what appeared to be mental tranquility. And so that, I think it was the first time I had seen a Buddhist monk. And clearly, for me, the question was, what's this guy doing with his mind? At that point, I had used my own fantasy to create stories, to separate myself from my body, from my reality. And so I began wondering did he use his mind to accommodate burning up in some way. And so that became a very big question. But again, it's not, and I did go to Asia 2 years later, but it wasn't a straight path. I mean, the photograph never left my mind. I still think about it. Um, and I think yeah, that's enough.
Yeah, actually, that it was such a striking image to start the book with, and I was one of the many people who I remember that photo, and I will never forget it either. But like you said, I always thought that was a protest against the Vietnam War. I just had it in my mind that that's what that was. So learning about the real history behind that was illuminating for me. Linking what you just said to the earlier comment you made, where about kind of moving away from something at the beginning, and then slowly it starts to shift where some new inspiration or understanding or insight about moving towards something. And clearly it sounds like this photo was part of that, that there's something different about this person. And I can think about things I read. For me, it's like I've always been a reader. So like Dostoevsky and certain authors that had like these saintly figures in the books. For me, it was kind of something similar where it just awakened my imagination to something different about being human. So what was it? What were you moving towards? It sounds like that wasn't an overnight thing, but what emerged from that? What was it that was inspiring you to explore your own mind?
Well, part of my background in terms of the art world was to come from a society that placed tremendous value on the artist. And I grew up with the artist being the priesthood, as you said, and that nothing would get better than that. Nothing would become, that I wouldn't learn more from anything outside of these great geniuses that were in my life. But they didn't seem to know anything about that. So I knew if I was going to try to figure out something about what was going on with Taekwondo, I was going to have to look somewhere else. And as difficult as it was to read the book by Ouspensky about Gurdjieff, that also gave me a little bit of um, confidence that there was something out there. I didn't have any confidence in myself, but I began to understand there might be something else out there. And at some point, I had a very, very difficult situation in my own life that involved losing a baby. And at that point, I was in a lot of trouble and I needed a lot of help. And the thing that started, and then in a way, it's when I really started to practice. And the relationship between that and practice is that I had learned, because it seemed like a situation that would send me into psychotherapy, and I had already had various forms of therapy. But at that point, I remembered my experience with the Tibetan at the Tibetan refugee camp when I worked at Tibetan refugee camp when I was in Nepal. And one of the things I learned in that camp, which I had not known before, is that you could actually hold tremendous sadness and tremendous joy at the same time, that those things could coexist in your life, and that you could become bigger than your own individual sadness, and that you didn't have to get stuck with some trauma that was in your life, that you could actually make a shift. And so at that point, I thought that I would try a spiritual practice rather than just go back into psychotherapy. And so it was a classic example of wanting to overcome some suffering. Not that I hadn't suffered before, but it hadn't been that defined and consolidated for me.
Yeah, that's such a powerful image, and uh, just that idea of how we hold the tragedy of samsara and all the suffering of just being human in this world, and yet the possibility of joy and awakening and kindness and compassion and all of these things that you experienced in the Tibetan refugee camp. And it reminds me of my time as well. As you know, I lived for many years also in Tibetan refugee settlements and was so struck by that exact same thing. I mean, I heard stories that were utterly heartbreaking. I mean, I'll start crying if even thinking about them now is already kind of, bringing tears to my eyes. And yet a lightness at the same time, that people can be laughing and connecting with each other and not just, lost in their grief. What do you think it is as a practice? I mean, you've spent, your entire life both around these communities and teachers and doing these practices, and with the loss that you've experienced, how do you actually, how do you navigate that? How does practice help us in these moments? What would you share about what you learned through your own practice, or just being around individuals who were able to experience this in that way?
Well, I think with practice, your whole concept of yourself shifts.
Mm.
Who you are, what you are, the sort of fixity. In order to stay fixed on your own trauma, you have to sort of stay fixed on some idea of who you are, who you've ever been, who you will always be. And practice kind of shakes all that up. It's like it just makes everything more fluid. So, it's not like I tell a story in the book, which I just love, so I'm going to retell it. And it relates to this, and it was a major learning experience for me. And it didn't happen in the camp, but the story always brings me back to the camp. And it's the story where a French journalist is talking to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is telling a story about an old man comes to see him, and he wants to do a very robust practice. A monk comes to get transmission for a very robust practice. And the Dalai Lama says to him, "You're too old for this practice, really. You need to do something that's not so strenuous." And the old man goes away, and His Holiness learns that the old man commits suicide because he wants to be reborn quickly so he can do this more robust practice. And the journalist then says to the Dalai Lama, "How did you get over this?" And so for me, the pivotal moment in this story is that the Dalai Lama then says to the journalist, totally shocked by the question, he said, "How do you get over this? You don't get over this."
Mm.
And for me, that's the pivot, is like, you don't get over this. But and I don't know what he meant by this. I have my own interpretations. What does this mean? This grief, this sorrow, this remorse, whatever it is. But clearly, it doesn't stay front and central to your life. It doesn't take up your head. It doesn't take up all your mind space. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of people in my life who seem to be stuck in some childhood trauma that they just can't let go of. And they're still blaming their parents, and they're blaming the government, and they're blaming everybody. And it seems like that dysfunction, or that dissatisfaction, that anger, that unhappiness just is how they define themselves. Um, and so I think when you do meditate, and whether it's through meditation, maybe there are other ways. For us, it's been meditation. You begin to move around. You begin to have a sense of shifting reality, shifting personality, shifting mood, everything is kind of in flux. And so
Mm.
you're not just stuck with that one traumatic experience or whatever.
That's such a good description. I mean, the my early years meditating, it was exactly what you just said. I mean, the way you described so many people and so many of us in our lives, I just was completely, obsessed, not obsessed, but I just had this idea that I'm an anxious person. I'm just wired this way. This is how I am. And it was such a huge part of my story about myself, and how I would relate to people and relate to myself, to the point where it was just reality. It was like there wasn't even any question about, like, oh, it might not actually be this way. But the way you framed it, like, when you start to meditate, your whole sense of identity begins to shift. You start to see, you understand, in my case, the anxiety and all these emotional patterns, but you start to see actually there's so much going on that you're not paying attention to when you're caught up in the storyline of that's running through your mind all the time. It's such a powerful thing. So I'm curious, so this notion of identity, another question I had was, writing a memoir, of course, is all about exploring your inner story. And I'd love to hear what you learned from unpacking your own life in so much detail. I imagine that there's insights you gained that you wouldn't gain through years of analytical meditation. I mean, it was probably like a long process of analytical meditation or something. I mean, what was it like kind of picking through your life in this way and figuring out what to write about and how to write about it, and sort of reconstructing and deconstructing your own identity through the writing process?
Ooh. Well, the most important piece of advice that I got from a friend many years ago before I started was you get to set your own coordinates. In other
Mm,
words, I knew from the beginning that there were certain aspects of my life that were very attractive to other people, like the art world. Those were not things I wanted to write about.
mm,
So that was a problem. Then I had, a lot of Dharma dirt. And publishers know I'm holding those cards. I don't want to write about that. So it was like a lot of the navigation was, since I chose to tell the story in a memoir form, how to navigate between what I really wanted to talk about and what would be a more accessible or juicy or something aspect of things that I could talk about. And I kind and actually knowing that kept me from writing this for a long, long time.
mm,
I couldn't do it because I didn't want to talk about the things that I knew other people wanted to hear about. So, but I did want to talk, I did want to say something about Buddhism in America. And I thought, well, after 50, 60 years, I could use my own life. So that became the kind of, how I could do that. But it meant being very careful about navigating between what I really wanted to talk about. And that had something to do with explorations of the mind, uh, and how that came into being. And also because uh, I think a lot of the histories of Buddhism are written about the way history is often written. It's written about events. You go from this event to that event, so and so came into the World Parliament of Religions in 1892, and then D.T. Suzuki did that, and there's somehow nothing in between about how messy it was and how
mm.
much stumbling around there was and how much confusion there was. And so, my own life incorporated all of that. So I thought, well, that I could talk about that. I could capture some of that craziness. And it was a very crazy time, as you mentioned. It was 60s, 70s, very different than it is now. Some of it, I wanted to capture something about our incredible naivete, our idealism, how much of it we got all wrong, how much, I mean, there were people my age who certainly understood the invitation that Buddhism presented much earlier than I did and took it much more seriously. But I think there were a lot more people like me who were taking, two steps back and one step forward and falling off the path and picking ourselves up and keeping going and like that.
I mean, one of the things that's so remarkable about the book is all the people that you knew and interacted with, and all the colorful characters. It was just so fun to read about. I had no idea that Allen Ginsberg loves to take his clothes off and swam naked in the Ganges River, for example. Like just like little tidbits like that. I was just like, what? But what I really loved more than anything else, and this is probably as much about me as the book is some of the stories about the meditation teachers, and in particular, there's some images, some pictures you paint about your time with Dudjom Rinpoche that for me was just like pure magic reading about it. And so for those who are listening who don't know, Dudjom Rinpoche is one of the towering figures of Tibetan Buddhism in the 20th century, one of the truly great masters. And Helen, you spent just we're able to be around him behind the scenes and interact with him in a way that few people were. And I loved how you wrote about that. I wonder if you could just share with everybody who's listening just what it was like to be in his orbit, just to be around him. You talked about like it's like being around space, something like that. You said something like that, which reminded me of my time being around Chögyam Rinpoche, who was another great Dzogchen master. What was that like being with such a remarkable person?
I was so out of it and I was so lost
Mm,
in the mid 70s that I couldn't take full advantage of who this person was. I mean, there were some people around him who understood his eminence and why and how he got there and what he was about. I wasn't one of those people. I couldn't really take, I mean, the way you're talking about him now is not an idea I had. Other people around me were saying, "Oh my God, this guy is coming to New York. You know, this is like God is about to descend on us." But I didn't know who he was, and I didn't. I was very new to Tibetan Buddhism, and like what I was saying before about all the people in between these great events, I was one of the many people around a center who was basically there to cook and clean. That's what we did, especially the women. And but there was a quality, and there was a quality in his person that was, and that's what I talk about looking through space or being in space, looking at space, falling through space. There was just absolutely no affect. And the way you could know that is simply by somewhat suddenly looking around and seeing how much affectation and contrivance there was among everybody else, including all of us, including me and everybody I was working with. You know, the way we're constantly kind of interacting by projecting an image or trying to find out who somebody is by information, like who are you? Where did you go to college? You know, like where did you grow up? I mean, all these questions that we ask as we try to place somebody so that we know who they are in relationship to me or who I am in relationship to them. Judy Rinpoche, he was like moving around, you know, like there was just nothing to hook into, nothing you could hook into.
Mm.
And so even knowing as little as I did, I could intuit that gift. And it gave me some, it was an experience of an empty mind. It was an experience of somebody who's not walking around with a lot of clutter, trying to figure things out. Um, and mostly, you know, when we interact with people, we get a pretty good sense of how busy their minds are, how much they're
Mm.
thinking, how much they're projecting, how much they're judging. It turns out that these things that are supposed to be so hidden in our minds turn out to be quite obvious. And so it's in comparison to that that suddenly this person that communicated none of that became very extraordinary.
And was it infectious to you? I mean, like the other thing that comes across in your writings about it, both in that time were around him a lot, and then with his son Tinley Norbu, is that they're clearly kind of provoking insights in the people around them. I mean, all this thing like, look at your mind. Where is your mind? I mean, just in different ways, asking that over and over again. Later, you talk about the same thing with Mingyur Rinpoche. So it's not just that you're kind of around these beings who are just utterly not following the script of being human. You know, it's like they're on some
Right,
other script or probably no script.
right.
But they're also kind of provoking it, like the people around them. I mean, Tinley Norbu was like famously provocative.
Yeah.
So what was that like? What was your inner experience being exposed to somebody who just didn't have a script for, for interacting with the world as the rest of us do?
Well, you do hit on something which I had sort of forgotten about, but it's also it is in the book that my first private interview with him, and I'm
Mm.
like the stumble, I'm in there to cook. I'm the cook. That was my job. I was the cook.
Well, you're the cook with the best, amazing, most amazing karma in
I
the
know, I
history of
know, I
cooks.
know. Of course, you have to remember in those days there were like 20 of us around him.
Mm.
Now there'd be thousands. But in
Yeah,
those
that's
days,
true.
he knew who he was, and nobody, and he was in New York, and so it was the accessibility now just seems extraordinary. But we didn't know that at the time, or I didn't know that at the time. And but in my first private interview, he does ask me, "What color is your mind?" And I'm like sitting there, I have no idea what he's talking about. I mean, again, I had grown up in a world that prized curiosity, intellectual playfulness, creativity. And this guy is asking me, "What color is your mind?" It's like he could have been asking me from Mars. I had never encountered, I had never even imagined such a question. So, so I mean, I knew I was in some realm that that was completely foreign to anything that I knew about. But I grew up in a society that valorized the conceptual mind, the intellectual mind, the historical mind, the nuanced mind. This was a whole different, this is a whole different planet.
Do you remember what happened in your mind when he asked you that? I mean, was it just
I went,
conceptual, like what is he talking about, or
I
did
went
something open up? I mean, what? Yeah,
I went completely blank, but it was not like an enlightened,
not like a good blank.
no, it wasn't like, oh, it wasn't like that. It was just like, duh. It wasn't an enlightened aha moment. Oh, I get it. I don't have a mind. It wasn't like that at all. It was like, mm.
Yeah. So fast forward to, I mean, now you of course, have decades and decades of practice where you understand where a question like that is meant to lead. And, you've obviously done, just countless hours of meditation and retreats and all these things. At what point did these questions, and maybe we could fast forward to your relationship with Mingyur Rinpoche, because of course, I mean, Mingyur Rinpoche, is like he's like a surgeon, with with the mind, I mean, he's like has such a level of precision in asking questions like that. What is it? What was it that attracted you to Mingyur Rinpoche, and how did this whole inner exploration that in many ways began, and or at least a pivotal moment was with Dudjom Rinpoche sitting in that interview, planting seeds, kind of begin to come to fruition?
Court, there's a direct line there
Hmm.
because um, at some point, sort of somewhat typical of Nyingma Sanghas, the Sangha around Dudjom Rinpoche fractured.
Hmm.
Not, not so unheard of. And then after a little while of not being very, very lost, I moved into the Zen community of New York. And I was a Zen practitioner for many years, and I had started studying with Maizumi Roshi. Then when he died, I was once again very lost. And I maintained a practice, but somewhere I got stuck in what Zen calls, the getting stuck in emptiness. And
Hmm.
I got very confused about spaciousness and spacing out. And And at some point, after not having a teacher for several years, I thought, this isn't actually working out too well. And so I began to, and I was just moving away from tricycle at that point, so I was able to have more time to actually go on some retreats and explore certain situations. And I met Mingyur Rinpoche in New York City, and he mentioned that he was doing a retreat at Gempo Abbey in Nova Scotia.
Hmm.
And I had a house in Nova Scotia, about 2 hours south of Gempo Abbey for many, many years, decades, before the Abbey moved there, before Trungpa Rinpoche moved his scene into Halifax area and then bought the land for the Abbey in Cape Breton. And so I thought, well, that's right up the road from me. That's like looking a gift horse in the mouth if I don't go. So I signed up. And so for 5 days, Mingyur Rinpoche asked a group, it was the retreat was for the residents. So there were about 20, 30 people there.
Hmm.
And it was like, where is your mind? Where is it now? Over and over and over and over again. And coming out of this sort of spaced out experiences that I was having on my own, it was like manna from heaven. I just couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't get enough of the specificity. Where is your mind? Where is it now? Just boom, 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 boom. And even though all of these questions were pointing to some non-conceptual comprehension, the questions themselves sounded really specific.
Hmm.
They felt like as specific and dense as bullets. Boom, boom, boom. They were pointing towards something that was way out there, but it had had a kind of specificity that was just exactly what I wanted. And
Hmm.
then that winter, it's about 2005 or six. I can't remember exactly. And then that winter, I went to Bodh Gaya, and that's when I first met you.
Hmm.
And I figure, I don't know whether it was the very beginning of Tergar. We were in Bodh Gaya. He was giving teachings. I don't remember.
Yeah, actually, one of the most amusing lines of the book was, I think it was around that time you were meeting him in Nova Scotia, and you said something like, or wrote something like, I really liked that, I thought, oh, I'll study with him because it's such a like an intimate, small experience, just a few students. And he said something like, and I couldn't have like realized I got it so horribly wrong because of course he's now has thousands of students all over the world and his retreats are so huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, those kind of intimate days, yeah, it's such special moments, and that you were able to spend time with him so intimately. And actually, I work closely with Rinpoche, but you've been able to spend so much time with him working on these books. You've done two books with him, co-written two books with him. You're working on a third one. What is it like working with him in that way, working with a teacher? I mean, in many ways, the way you describe Dudjom Rinpoche is sometimes how I experience Mingyur Rinpoche of just like it feels like just sort of hanging out with space. Like there's nothing, like if you get him talking about meditation, he won't stop talking. But there's not a lot of like, like, hey, how are your kids? And,
Yeah.
what's your favorite movie? And, like, what did you do on vacation?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. So what has it been like working with him so intimately in these books and the one you're currently doing?
Well, I tell a story in the book about working on, I think it was the first book, Turning Confusion into Clarity. And I'm with him working in Sherabling in northern India, in the monastery that he grew up in. And so at some point, the monks, there are hundreds of monks there, and they're doing a special practice, and they're not allowed to talk. And so it's very odd, uh, the whole monastery, because they're often, and when they're not in the meditation hall, they're giggling and cracking each other up and horsing around. They're very playful, and suddenly everything goes quiet. It's like a movie that just the sound gets turned off. And I go to meet with Mingyur Rinpoche, and he explains that because of the special teachings and the special circumstances, that we can only talk about Dharma. At which point we both crack up laughing because that's all we talk about. It's not like we're talking
Like you're
about
good at, yeah, like you're
yeah.
gossiping about the movie
And
stars or something.
that's true when I'm working with him too. Sometimes people kind of think I have this very special connection to him, and in some ways I do, but in other ways, there's nothing going on between us that doesn't go on in a completely public forum, or not giving me anything that he wouldn't give anybody else who walks in or that he's teaching to. In that sense, this is like what you were talking about. It's never like, how was your trip? Well, actually, Rinpoche, I'm completely jet lagged and I'm not even sure I can sit up straight, but other than that, I'm fine. But it's nothing, he, I mean, it's one of the things that I was so attracted to, that I trusted so much, is that his total complete dedication, his devotion, his sincerity, those qualities that I think many of us have come to appreciate were so evident. And it's evident in what you're talking about. It just he never moves off track in that way. I don't know if that quite
Yeah,
answered.
no, it's true. I mean, there's no, and it's funny the way you describe it because just because of the role I play in Tergar, people assume that I'm just like hanging out with Rinpoche and like, whatever, drinking margaritas on the beach or something. I don't know what people think, but really, it's kind of, he's like what you see when he teaches. Like that's kind of how he is all the time. I mean, he's just all about practice, and if people have sincere questions about the Dharma and meditation, he's just overflowing with generosity. And there's just, other than that, it's space. It's not. There was one funny incident I had where I was actually was around these years in Bodh Gaya where we met, and I was working, at the just helping set up this institute that we had going at the monastery at the time. So oftentimes I would need to just run in and ask him a quick question. And I remember one time I went up and his attendant said, "Oh, he's upstairs. You just go up and knock on his door." And I went up and I knocked on his door and he said, "Come in." And I opened the door and he was just sitting on his bed. And it sounds like almost like not even worth mentioning, but there was something quite profound in it. He was just sitting there and it was like there was nothing he was doing. Like the TV wasn't on. He didn't have the phone there. There wasn't some meditation text. It was like it wasn't like he had come out of meditation or something. It was just like utterly ordinary, but it was like, what are you doing, Rinpoche? He just seemed to be just like literally just sitting, like as though there was nothing to do. It's hard to communicate, but for me, it was just one of these moments, kind of like you talked about Didgeridoo. There was no, it wasn't he was working through some script of what you do in certain situations. It felt like this little moment of almost like I peered into his inner world and there was just nothing going on. It was just openness and that's it. So I'm
There's a,
curious. Yeah, please,
go
please.
ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'd just love to hear anything about the book you're working on now, but please, if you want to comment or anything that sparked for you. But I'd also love to just hear what you're working on these days with him.
Well, Rinpoche was very keen to write a book on Buddha nature, although that is not a term that we use in this book. He wants it to be for non-Buddhists, and he wants it to be very short, very pithy, and to be as accessible as possible. And so that's what we've been working on. And it's really a way to try to address his understanding of where we're at right now in this very confusing world that we're living in, and to give people, I guess we were talking about before, you don't have to live with the confusion that the media will tell you you have to live with. There are alternatives.
Hmm.
And I think he really is very keen to communicate that we have resources, inner resources that we can draw on. And we don't, the world's a mess. I don't think anybody wants to deny that, including Minda Rinpoche. But we don't have to be a mess. We have ways of creating some sanity for ourselves. And of course, that sanity is going to contribute to sanity in the world. If we're a mess and we're angry and we're terrified and we're in a state of panic all the time about the war in the Middle East, about climate change, about AI, then we're just going to contribute that anxiety and that fear and that panic to the world. That's not going to help. So it's
Hmm.
like, is there a way to reduce that? Is there a way to tamp that down a little bit? And tamp down those fires. And I use that word because, um, with Thich Nhat Hanh, when he sets himself on fire, I think he does have something to teach us now. And it's not about how to set yourself on fire. That is not our goal. But there is something about learning how to live within the flames, and
Hmm.
and feeling that we're living in a world on fire is a pretty common expression these days. We feel that the earth is literally heating up, but so are our minds. And so Rinpoche is really, I think, trying to uh, how do you might not be able to put out the forest fires in California or all over the world where they're happening, but you can learn to put out some of the fires that are in our own minds. We have access to that. And he makes that point over and over again that I think the expression he uses is your mind is in your hand. Is that right? Your mind is in your hand.
Hmm.
That so so I think he's very keen to communicate how much we can do for ourselves, because this is like talking about people who don't know about meditation, or don't know something about the flexibility or the fluidity of their lives. They think they're stuck, especially the younger people. They're stuck with this awful situation. They're stuck. They're stuck with this war. They're stuck with this climate change. They're stuck with governments that aren't working with them, and then they get to blame everybody, and they're so angry about everything. And moral outrage seems to be everybody's favorite mode of being these days. And I think Rinpoche is trying to say, wait a second, it doesn't have to be that way. You have
Hmm.
alternatives. And so talking about Buddha nature, again, not using that term, but using classic teachings on our inner selves, our inner refuge, our inner home, I think could be very, very helpful for people at this time.
Hmm. Well, it sounds like a perfect book for this time. So we've actually got a bunch of questions that are coming from online, from YouTube and Facebook, some of the platforms where people are watching this. So I'll just see if we can get to a few of these. One person wrote, "What interests you the most when you think about the future of Buddha Dharma in the West?"
I used to think about the future a lot about Buddhism in America, and I don't know where anything's going. I don't know if we have a future. I stopped trying to figure it out. I have no idea. I do know that I feel very strongly that in the midst of all this chaos that people seem to experience, that that some of the very most basic, most fundamental aspects of Buddhist teachings are more relevant now than ever.
Mm.
Whatever you want to call them, whether they get to come under Buddhism or Buddhist rubric, or you call them something else, uh, the I think that just the information that your own mind is the key to liberation, key to suffering, and the key to liberation. That's radical, and that is more needed now than ever.
Mm. Mm. I couldn't agree more. And how do you have such a unique vantage point, kind of forget about the future aspect. You've seen Buddhism unfold in the modern world and had a kind of a front row seat and been an active, player on the stage of that. And you talked about the 60s and the 70s, obviously tricycle starting up in the 90s, and that gave you an even more kind of front row seat and active role in what was happening. What strikes you about where we're at now? Like, what is sort of the unique flavor that having kind of seen it look in all these different forms and flavors over the years? What is it about now that we might not be seeing so clearly, but if you kind of stack it up against how it looked at other times, might be unique or help us give us some insight into what's currently going on in the world of Buddhism and meditation?
Well, my generation of Buddhists, of convert Buddhists, we clearly, Buddhism was clearly part of a countercultural rejection of our country. It was during the Vietnam years. So we were rejecting the war, we were rejecting certain aspects of capitalism, uh, uh, certain aspects of convention, sexual conventions, uh, dress conventions, gender conventions. And then very slowly, I think Buddhism sort of turned and tried to figure out how to become more integrated with the
Mm,
West. And I think there's a lot of very positive aspects to that. But I think also we've sometimes, at least I sometimes am concerned that the concern with how to adapt this to certain values or certain things that are going on now, Buddhism becomes subjected to the cultural flavors. The timelessness of Buddhism becomes subjected and sometimes, I think, quite dented by certain temporary uh, cultural movements. And,
mm,
uh, and I think sometimes the American teachers, frankly, I think sometimes the American teachers don't have the confidence to hold the line.
mm,
So they often go into the reality of very young students who are trying to figure out, let's say, how do you, I mean, in the 70s, we tried to use Dharma to figure out how to stop the war too. So it's it's not exactly that it's the first time this is happening, but we learned from our Buddhist teachers that our protest efforts and our rebellious efforts and being rebellious uh, was also a way of ego aggrandizement. That's what they kept
mm,
telling us. Oh, we didn't get that. We thought we were being so heroic, protesting and marching, and we thought we were just, that this was just a wonderful thing to do. It was compassionate. We were using our Buddhist teachings to show our compassion, wearing our compassion on our hearts. And they're basically saying, you can't use you can't use an outside situation, as bad as it could be. You
mm,
can't use that to justify your own anger. And so I feel like we're going through another cycle of that now. But I'm not sure that the teachers themselves are willing to risk holding a more timeless Buddhist line.
mm. That's powerful. Yeah. I mean, the whole cancel culture, it makes it a scary thing if you don't toe the line of exactly, what is the right way to think and feel and talk and behave in this day and age. Yeah, that's a huge one. so I realize we're almost to the end of our time here, but there were some great questions, and I wanted to ask one more question from the audience because I think it's something that you said about your own journey that I'm sure many people relate to about this feeling of like fumbling around and you kind of have some vague sense of where it's going, but not sure kind of where to go. So somebody who's listening on Facebook wrote, you mentioned that in your earlier days you were fumbling for a lot for a long time. What kept you going and balanced somehow?
Well, I wouldn't say I was balanced. I definitely I kept falling off the path. So I don't know. I wouldn't use the word balance. Yeah, you would ask me earlier or something about what I learned from writing the book.
Hmm.
And it's true that I saw myself as stumbling and stumbling, stumbling. By the end of the book, by the end of the time I finished it, I saw that there was a kind of perseverance there that I had never attributed to myself.
Hmm.
And why is that? I think at some point I recognized in Dharma something that was just so true. It was like just the most true thing around. And even if I was not a dedicated student or a good student or whatever that means, that there was something true there. And however much I stumbled and fell and whatever, that there was something true in there that was more genuine, more authentic than anything I had ever encountered. And so it was just worth going towards again and again. There was nothing, even though I kept getting hopelessly seduced into all kinds of samsara illusions, there was I kept coming back to the thing that was the most true.
Hmm. And how would you sum that up? I mean, a lifetime of in the Dharma and studying and practicing these teachings. If you could go back to that young self who was just getting started and trying to figure out how to be human in a difficult world, how would you sum that truth up? What would you say?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure I get the question really. I don't know how, I'm not sure I'm understanding what.
Well, you talked about finding something that was true, like there's something that kept you going through that period of fumbling around. And obviously now things that were not at all clear to you then, like what did Rinpoche ask? Like now you could probably write chapters and chapters just on what was going on if you wanted to. But at the time, it was just some kind of atmospheric thing that was difficult to pinpoint or understand what was happening. So what would you say if you could go back and talk to that younger self? Is there anything that you would say just to bring a little clarity or a little inspiration or wisdom for that period when I think a lot of us feel like we're just fumbling around. We have some, again, a vague notion that we should keep going with it, but it's not so clear what our next step should be or how we should look at ourselves or see the world.
One of the I think great gifts that Mingyur Rinpoche offers is he has the most amazing way of taking every single situation and turning it into something positive and optimistic and in your favor. I didn't have that as a child
Mm.
or as a teenager or as a 20 something. Whatever you're doing. So if he sees you, if now when I look back and I try to apply these amazing view of every single thing, it's like everything becomes, um, in a way, everything becomes an expression of taking care of yourself, of caring for
Mm.
yourself, of caring for others, a compassion for yourself. If you stumble, that's you taking care of yourself. If you can't stay on the path in some kind of straight and narrow way, that's you taking care of yourself for whatever your needs are, which may be totally neurotic and completely hidden and neurotic and counterproductive. But in his view that I've learned from him, it's always a way of understanding it in terms of caring for yourself. And if that caring for yourself is to go down a hole and sit there for a month or two or a year or two, then that's what it takes. So I would use those teachings of his
Mm.
to go back and even in terms of my attention to Fantasyland. No therapist ever spoke to me about that as if it was a way of protecting myself. It was always considered some neurotic,
Mm.
some neurotic denial, some neurotic escape or something. Nobody ever said, "Wow, what a genius that you figured out how to take care of yourself by disappearing in plain sight." So, something like that.
Well, Helen, on behalf of really the entire Buddhist community and meditators, everybody listening, very grateful that you did keep going and that you have led the life that you've led, that you've done all the things that you have. The books that you've written, your new book, Lotus Girl, which again, I would highly recommend to everybody who's listening, and all the work with Tricycle, which not only was a pioneering magazine back in the 90s when it first started, but to this day is still that pioneering organization and kind of a leading light in the Buddhist world and doing such amazing work. None of that would have happened without your willingness just to keep going and keep exploring. So I'm sure I speak for everybody when I just say it's been a tremendous inspiration to have a few minutes to chat with you and to hear a little bit more about you and your life. And also what you just mentioned about Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings. Before you go, I thought I would just mention, since we always get a ton of questions about people wondering about Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings and what is available. So maybe I can just share a little bit about the joy of living, which is very much what you just mentioned, Helen. So this approach to meditation that Mingyur Rinpoche teaches very much, Helen, what you mentioned about connecting with these innate qualities of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The way Rinpoche teaches that is through this Joy of Living program. There's been countless meditators around the world. I mean, it's how I myself got started with Rinpoche after meditating for many years. And I went to a retreat with Rinpoche, and it was just like, oh my God, like this is just suddenly so clear, highlighting things that I didn't even know about my own mind and meditation, even though I'd been practicing a long time. And as you said, Helen, it's really just based on the simple idea that we already have these qualities within us. And we don't need to look at all of our shadows and demons and neuroses as obstacles, that these are actually the very thing that can help us get in touch with these qualities of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. So this is a very step-by-step path. You can get started for free. All the information is here. If you want to go to the next slide, you'll see that part of what's unique about this is that it's also a way to connect with people around the world who are similarly walking the path of meditation, bringing these teachings into everyday life. And, there's so many apps these days, there's so many courses, and actually so many of them are brilliant and really laying out the path of meditation in different ways. I think what's unique about Mingyur Rinpoche's approach in the joy of living is first just this view that you mentioned, Helen, of just viewing everything through the light of our own innate goodness and wholesomeness, that we can tap into this even when we are wrestling with our inner demons. I think the other part is just a very clear path to follow. So it's just very clear kind of where to go and where this is all leading. And the other thing I would say is a sense of community. If you want to go to the next slide, this capacity or the opportunity we have just to connect with other people. So, of course, having a great teacher like Mingyur Rinpoche, but also having other guides. You can see Tim Olmsted, who's a really brilliant teacher who Helen and I both know, a bunch of our other guides who you can see here as well, and an opportunity just to connect with students around the world. I'm sure we have students listening right now. You're probably scattered around the world. Usually there's people from 30, 40 different countries. And it's so cool just to connect with other meditators and see that we're not alone on this journey. So I think we can turn off the slides. Um, so Helen, I just want to again end with a note of gratitude and maybe just as a closing opportunity, I just wanted to ask if there's anything else going on around the book, any other events, things that might be going on, because I'm sure there's all sorts of opportunities to hear more from you around your new book.
Oh, thank you. There is a Helen Tworkov page. I don't do social media, but there's a helentworkov.com page, and that lists past and future podcasts and events. And also, for those of you in the New York City area, I'm going to be at the Rubin Museum this coming Friday, May 10th, with Mark Epstein. So please join us for that if you can. That would be live at the museum. Thank you. Thanks, Court. This was fun.
Yeah, yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Helen. A big shout out and a huge bow of gratitude to Tricycle as well, who is co-sponsoring this, and just to thank as a meditator who's benefited greatly from Tricycle and read it endlessly over the years. And just a final plug for this book. This is just I just can't tell you. I've had so many moments of delight and insight reading it. I know everybody out there, if you pick it up, that you won't be able to put it down. It's just a fantastic read, filled with really interesting stories and a lot of great insights about Buddhism in the West and meditation. So, Helen, again, thank you so much. And thank you to the huge team that helped us put on this event. And to everybody else around the world, thank you for coming. Look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Take care, everyone.